Hello everyone, and welcome back to our adventure through the book of Joshua. Today we are on Joshua chapter 10, and we're going to try to discuss it in 5 minutes. If you want the free PDF that's available online, there's a link down in the description where you can download it. Okay, when did the events of this chapter happen historically? The Israelites began their conquest of the Promised Land in approximately 1450 BC, and it lasted approximately 5 to 7 years. Couple key characters that we need to mention in this chapter. Of course, Joshua, he's the leader of the Israelites and the Israelite army. I'm going to talk about the Gibeonites. You remember them from last chapter? They used deception to make a peace treaty with Israel, which comes into play in this chapter when we meet our last main group of characters, and that's the 5 kings of the Amorites. The 5 kings of the Amorites allied together and they attacked Gibeon after hearing that the Gibeonites had made a peace treaty with Israel. Now let's try to identify where on the map these events took place. The Israelites were camped at Gilgal. They fought the 5 Amorite kings near the city of Gibeon. And then as we go through the rest of the chapter, Israel's traveling and conquering new territories and new cities in southern Canaan. And a list of those territories and cities is given in the 3rd section of our outline. So if you do go online and download the PDF, that will be helpful. You'll be able to bounce back and forth the 2 pages and see where all these places are located. Okay, jump over to page 2 and we'll talk about our outline. The first section that I have here is a really interesting one. It contains one of the more interesting miracles that is described in the Bible, although it doesn't give us a ton of detail about it. This is verses 1 through 15. The sun and moon stand still. So when a guy named Adonizedek, who was the king of Jerusalem, heard about the destruction of Ai and the pact, the peace treaty that the Gibeonites had made with the Israelites, he was afraid because the Gibeonites were a strong people. It says that they were warriors, and if they thought it necessary to make peace with Israel, then he thought we might be in trouble. So the king of Jerusalem decided that he was going to actually attack not Israel, but the city of Gibeon. And he enlisted the help of some kings to help him do this. The kings of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, and a bunch of those cities are on the map. When the Gibeonites learned that these 5 kings were coming against them to attack them, they sent to Joshua and they said, hey, we made peace with you. Send some people over here to help us and to save us from these 5 kings. Joshua and his army marched all night from Gilgal to Gibeon and attacked the 5 kings. And the text says that God threw the enemy army into, what does it say exactly? It's on my outline here. God threw the armies of the 5 kings into a panic, and the Israelites routed them. Now, God had a miraculous part in this battle as well. We're told God caused large stones to hail down on Israel's enemies, and they killed many of the soldiers of the armies of the 5 kings, actually more than were killed by the Israelite soldiers. Now, we're also told, and here's the really interesting miracle, at Joshua's request, God made the sun and the moon stand still so that it would remain daylight, so that Joshua and his army would have light to pursue the fleeing enemies and to destroy their armies. Section number 2, verses 16 through 27, wraps up this battle and tells us what happens to the 5 kings. The 5 kings are captured is the title that I put on here. Now, the 5 allied kings, they realized they were losing the battle, and they hid themselves in a cave at Makkedah. And they were discovered, and the Israelites told Joshua. Joshua said to roll a stone or large stones in front of the mouth of the cave so no one could escape, while they finished up chasing down the enemy army and finishing them off. Now, after they had wiped out the enemy army, the Israelite army returned to Joshua there at the cave of Makkedah. The 5 kings were brought out, they were killed, and they were hung on a tree until the evening. And as the sun went down, their bodies were taken down, thrown into the cave, and the entrance to the cave was sealed. Our final section, verses 28 through 43, will take us through the end of the chapter. It is talking about the continued conquest of the Promised Land. So the end of Joshua 10 lists a series of kings and their territories that the Israelites conquered. These are mostly in southern Canaan. We'll talk about northern Canaan in the next chapter. The following territories and cities were conquered and are listed in the text, and you can find many of them on the map: Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Gezer, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, Goshen, Kadesh Barnea, Gaza, the hill country, the Negev, the lowlands, and the slopes. All of these territories and cities were, quote, devoted to destruction by Joshua and the Israelites. And the chapter just about closes off in verse 42 saying this, quote, "And Joshua captured all these kings and their land at one time because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel." So that is Joshua chapter 10. Now let's scroll down a little bit to our application section. Here's the application that I have for you today from this chapter. The primary purpose of the Bible isn't just to tell us about miracles, supernatural phenomenon, and heavenly oddities that may make us curious. If it were, it probably would have spent a lot more time talking about the great stones that were falling from heaven and the sun and the moon standing still. But you notice those pretty much get like 2 verses and then the story moves on. The Bible is intended to tell us the story about how God is saving the world. And yes, miracles are a part of that story, but God didn't write this book just to entertain people with a curiosity for the supernatural. And unfortunately, a lot of people view the Bible that way. A lot of people only want to read like these interesting texts in the Bible and talk about those, but there's a lot more to the story that is super important, and we're reading the Bible incorrectly if we just go to it whenever we want to read about these kinds of miraculous fascinations.